But this was an eye opener for me. And I remember hanging out with you having dinner not too long ago where you specced out sort of the chemical structure of, I guess it was beta hydroxybutyrate and a number of, other ketone, I guess it'd be salts, right? Or am I
No, they're actually salts or esters.
Esters,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But what are synthetic ketones and why might people care about them?
Well, I think to explain it, I probably have to spend a minute explaining what ketones are biologically, or what we call endogenous ketones. So, if you think back to what our ancestors were doing up until, a few hundred years ago, or certainly a few thousand years ago, we were basically often going 24 hours or longer without food. And that was just the nature of how things worked, right? And when you're in the hunter-gatherer mindset, that's your life. Now, the human body has only really evolved to store a finite amount of glucose. And there's only two places we store glucose. One is in the liver, one is in the muscles. And it's only that stash in the liver that's accessible by the brain, because the glucose that gets stored in the muscle can't leave the muscle. It circulates within the muscle. So we have this organ, the brain, which, weighs maybe 2% of our overall body weight, but probably accounts for 20% of our body's metabolic demand. And on top of that, it ordinarily functions exclusively on glucose. And so you have this problem, which is you have an organism that is wildly dependent on glucose, and we can only store a fraction of what we need. We can only store about 1 day's worth.
About 400 grams, like 1,600 calories?
It really depends on the size of the person, but yeah,
right.
That's probably about right for average. And remember, most of that, by the way, is not accessible to the whole body.
Right.
So the trick that we evolved was, rather than make glucose out of protein, which is a pretty easy thing to do, the problem with that is if you want to make glucose out of protein, you have to break down muscle. And the last thing you want to do when you're out there trying to find your next meal is lose muscle at the expense of getting glucose for your brain. So what if there was a way we could get the brain to use fat? Right? That's the problem that needed to be solved. And the solution was a beautiful one, right? Which is we can break down fat, of which even the leanest hunter-gatherer had days and days, if not months of fat on their body. What if you could break that fat down in the liver into another type of molecule distinct from glucose that the brain specifically could actually utilize as fuel? And that's where ketones enter. And so what our bodies do when prolonged fasting occurs, and by prolonged, I really mean it even begins at 24 hours of fasting, is we start breaking down our own sources of fat. We start making this thing you referred to, beta hydroxybutyrate, that, not to get too geeky on it, but beta hydroxybutyrate and another member of that family called acetoacetate, they exist in an equilibrium. And these things get shuttled into the Krebs cycle, which I think your readers will be familiar with. And it basically becomes another substrate for making ATP. And so all of a sudden, and George Cahill, who is sort of a luminary in this field, passed away a few years ago, but George Cahill is one of the leading godfathers in metabolism at Harvard University. He did some legendary experiments in the 50s and 60s where they had subjects that they would starve for 7 to 14 days and just measure glucose levels and ketone levels. And you'd think that after 14 days of not eating, a person would be, mentally foggy, not well. And it turned out it was just the opposite, right? After a couple day lull, and you know this personally, Tim, because you've done these long fasts.
Right.
After a couple days of hell, it's actually the reverse, right? You sort of get sharp. Yeah, you feel unbelievable. And what Cahill showed was, what fraction of the brain's energy was coming from those ketones. So, okay, so that's relevant. That's starving. But look, outside of the odd, let's do a 1 week a year fast sort of thing, how does that play into something beyond that? Well, the other way you can achieve ketosis, though not to the same extreme, is through something called nutritional ketosis, which is restricting the one dietary component primarily that restricts ketone formation and keeping at a minimum the other one that also restricts it. And those are carbohydrates and proteins respectively. And so if you eat a diet that has very little carbohydrate in it and only a modest amount of protein, and the rest of it, of course, made up from fat, you can also generate ketones. Now, to your question, it turns out that you can drink or, consume in some fashion, but they're all typically liquid. You can drink these ketone molecules directly. And that's what we call these exogenous or supplemental ketones. And they come in multiple different forms. They basically exist as a beta hydroxybutyrate ester. a beta hydroxybutyrate salt, and an acetoacetate diester. And I've tried all of these things, and I can safely say,
tell people, why don't you recount your first experience consuming?
Yes. So the first one I tried was the beta hydroxybutyrate ester, which a very good friend of mine sent me, and I had been told these things taste horrible. That I had talked to two people who had consumed them before, and these are stoic dudes. Like, these aren't, this isn't like a 6-year-old kid, right? This is like stoic military dudes who said, "Oh man, that's the worst tasting stuff on earth." And so I knew that, but I think that piece of information was sort of like fleeting in the excitement when the box came. And so I tear open the box, and also there was a note in there that explained a somewhat palatable cocktail that you could mix that, like how you could mix this with 10 other things. And I just disregarded that. And I just took out like the 50 milliliter flask and I chugged it. And I remember it was like 6 a.m. because my wife was still sleeping. And, all these thoughts go through your mind. So first of all, you drink it and it tasted like how I imagine jet fuel or diesel would taste. If you've ever smelled distillate, it's this horrible odor and you can sort of imagine what it would taste like. This is what it tasted like. And so my first thought was, God damn, like, what if I go blind? Like, what if there's like methanol in here? Like, what did I just do? And then my next thought was just, oh my God, you're gagging. I mean, you're really gagging. And now if you puke this stuff up, you're going to have to like lick up your puke and this stuff. I mean, it's just going to be a disaster, right? And so I'm like retching and gagging and like trying not to wake up the family and trying not to like spew my ketone esters all over the kitchen. And it took like 20 minutes for me to get out and do my bike ride, which was the whole purpose of that experiment.
Must have been a record setter.
Oh God. It was, those things are unbearable. So, until they figure out a way.
No, just to put that in perspective, I'm speculating here, but correct me if I'm wrong. I would imagine, much like myself, you've made a somewhat secondary career of choking down foul tasting shit, like gels on rides, or like all these protein powders, like the most hideous, ostensibly performance enhancing sports supplements. So you get to a point where you're like, I've had bad stuff. How bad could it really be?
I'm a generally insensitive person to bad taste. This took it to another level. And, the funny thing is I'm such a glutton for punishment. I had the guy send me like half a liter of it after because I was determined to make it work. Like, I got to figure out, and I would like try mixing it with this and mixing it with that. And also I wanted people to try it with me. So I would like, anytime I had a friend over, I'd make him, dip his pinky in to at least try like a sliver of it. And without, I mean, even some of the most stoic people I know were like, wow, that is unbelievable. Like, you couldn't design something to taste that bad. So, the good news is the acetoacetate diester actually can be put into a capsule. So, if you're willing to take 20 capsules in one sitting, each one the size of a horse pill, you can trade one problem for another. So you get rid of the taste, but then you have to gag down 20 capsules, which also tends to induce the desire to vomit. So, went down that path for a while and then really settled in on the beta hydroxybutyrate salts. And to this day, though, I don't use them that often because they're, pretty expensive and we're not at a point in time yet where we have a great like supply of them.
Mm-hmm. And what are the potential benefits or advantages of consuming these synthetic ketones?
Well, the benefit that interested me the most, which came out of the research done by a guy named Richard Veech at NIH.
How do you spell Veech?
Veech. Now, it turns out, you may remember a moment ago I mentioned George Cahill at Harvard, who is like a god. I've never met George Cahill, but I've met Richard Veech, and Richard Veech actually did his postdoc with Cahill. So he came from that sort of lineage of uber smart folks. And Veech showed in animal models that when you switched the substrate from glucose or even fatty acid to ketones, you could generate more ATP, more mechanical work for less oxygen. And the difference was enormous in the animal models. I also saw some unpublished data that looked at this in athletes, human athletes, that is, and it suggested that there was a difference. So one of the things I wanted to do was do an experiment, right? Which was, look, for a certain athletic event, there may be an advantage to being able to consume less oxygen for a fixed power output. And that may not be true for all athletic events. Would that benefit a basketball player or a tennis player where you're stopping and starting and it's more explosive? I'm not sure. But I think it would address someone doing a long, steady state sub-threshold effort.
Now, sub-threshold, you mean below their anaerobic threshold?
Correct. Below ventilatory and anaerobic threshold. So, when we do marathon stuff, we refer to all-day pace, which is sort of, it's typically about 65% of your VO2 max is a pace that you can probably, once you get really well tuned, you can probably hold that pace for 10 to 12 hours.
Got it. Persistence hunter speed.
Yeah.
Got it. Cool. And now ketosis is a really fascinating state, and we don't have to delve too far into the, maybe just to address a common point of confusion. People sometimes fear ketosis, thinking of it as ketoacidosis. Could you, as observed in some people with diabetes,
right?
They're not the same thing as I understand it, or what is?
That's correct. Yeah, they're related in the way that a house fire and a fireplace are related. So when a house is on fire, there's fire everywhere. And when you have a fireplace on, there's fire in there. So they have an association, but that's where it ends, right? Whereas in the fireplace is like a well-controlled thing that actually adds some value, whether it be light or heat. The house fire is obviously not a controlled thing, and therefore it's not a positive thing. It's a destructive thing. So ketoacidosis is indeed a very destructive phenomenon, and it is a situation that rises almost exclusively in people with type 1 diabetes. Now, I've read some really interesting case reports of people who are not type 1 diabetic who have had ketoacidosis, but the examples of that are so rare that I think it's just almost confusing to talk about them. So
yeah,
for the purpose of most people, ketoacidosis is a state that occurs usually when someone with type 1 diabetes gets sick. There's usually a precipitating event. And what basically happens is a deficiency of insulin, because a type 1 diabetic requires exogenous insulin. They have to be injecting themselves with insulin. So you have a mismatch between the need for insulin and glucose. And what's basically happening is, in the absence of insulin, which actually suppresses ketones, their ketone levels rise. And once the ketones get kind of north of 15 millimolars, and certainly any higher, 20 to 25 millimolars, you basically get into an acid-base problem where the pH now starts to drop. And so you get what's called a metabolic acidosis in response to that. And so, I feel like I must have taken care of 100 people with ketoacidosis when I was back in the emergency room. It's a life-threatening illness, but the good news, it's a very simple treatment. You give them massive amounts of IV fluid, glucose, insulin, potassium, and they're usually better within 2 days. Now, ketosis, totally different. Someone who has a normal working pancreas can't really generate ketones north of, I've heard of the odd person who can get up to 9 or 10 millimolars, but for most people, even if they starved themselves for 2 weeks, and certainly in Cahill's subjects over, I think as high as 40 days, in the longest Cahill cohort, they plateau at 6 millimolars, which is still a very high level, but it's nowhere near the level that produces acidosis.
Yeah.
And that's because there's an auto-regulatory feedback